Hey, everybody. Welcome to A Mighty Blaze. I'm Jenna Blum, one of the co-founders of The Blaze. Welcome to our Friday Frontliner show when we interview our favorite authors. And today, I am so privileged to be hosting co-authors Alyson Richman and Shaunna Edwards. Welcome to The Blaze, ladies.
Thank you for having us.
Oh my God, I am so excited. And before I say anything else, I should let everybody out there in Blazelandia know that I am broadcasting from my house in rural Minnesota with a glitchy internet. So if I suddenly freeze or look like Nick Robertson, that is why. It is not for lack of enthusiasm. And then I will let these amazing authors chat amongst themselves if I should suddenly be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But meanwhile, I'm not going to move. I'm just going to sit very, very still, except for my mouth, and talk. And today we are so excited to be talking about this amazing Civil War historical fiction, which you haven't purchased yet. You should purchase at least 50 copies of, at least, The Thread Collectors. So, Alyson, Shaunna, I'm so excited to talk to you about this, about your author collaboration, about your confab on this book. But first, I'm going to read your bios. So if you're ready for that, buckle up. You ready for the official?
We've got it. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, let's do this thing. Let's do Shaunna first. So Shaunna is the debut novelist of The Thread Collectors, co-authored with bestselling author Alyson Richman, a native Louisianian. Did I say that right?
You said it perfectly.
Because I practiced that ish. Shaunna majored in literature at Harvard, which you may have heard of. For attending NYU School of Law, which you also may have heard of. A former corporate lawyer, she now works in diversity, equity, and inclusion and lives in Harlem with her husband. Thread Collectors is her first book, but we hope the first of many, many. And my dear friend, Alyson Richman, who I love so much. I love you too, Shaunna. It's just that Allie and I have known each other for a really long time. Allie is the USA Today bestselling and #1 international bestselling author of several historical novels so beloved, including The Velvet Hours, The Garden of Letters, The Secret of Clouds, and The Lost Wife, which is, I have currently in development for a major motion picture, but I think I'm a little behind the curve on that. So tell us about that. Alyson's novels have been published in 25 languages and have reached bestseller lists in both the United States and everywhere abroad. She lives on Long Island in a beautiful house that I try to visit as much as possible with her husband and 2 children, except one child is actually now in college. So her husband, 1 child, and her amazing dog, Tofu. Where Tofu at? Where's Tofu?
Oh, Stephen has Tofu by the beach because we're afraid she's going to bark, but she's beloved.
She is. We love Tofu. And Allie is currently at work on her next novel. So I am told, and I would love to hear more about that as well. Welcome, ladies. And I want to know all about your collaboration on The Thread Collectors. But first, would you, in your own words, tell us what The Thread Collectors is about for our audience who has not yet read the novel?
Sure. Should I go, Alyson?
Yeah, you definitely should.
So in The Thread Collectors, you're going to meet 2 couples. There is a Black couple, brilliant musician William and his beloved Stella. Stella's a family name for me. And you're going to meet a Jewish couple, Jacob, also a brilliant musician, and his fiery redheaded abolitionist wife, Lily, who's described to look a lot like Alyson. And in the book, Jacob and William, they meet in the Union Army on the battlefields of Louisiana. And the friendship that happens between these 2 men and the bonds that music create give us a window into seeing how their women are surviving the war and ultimately how the lives of these 4 individuals are going to intersect. And there's a lot that happens along the way. It takes place at the height of the Civil War in 1863. You're seeing ordinary people survive, but there is also a lot of rich history in there that was really important for Alyson and I to bring to the forefront. So that's the broad strokes, that's the synopsis, but I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of different layers.
That was a very elegant and concise synopsis of a really beautiful and complicated book, or not complicated, it's not the right word, but complex. I was thinking that since the book is called The Thread Collectors, it actually is written almost like a tapestry with all of these intersecting lives. Hi, Tori Whitaker. We love you. Tori is another of our historical fiction novels with a book coming out on November 8th. Allie, do you have anything to add to Shaunna's description of this?
No, I always love Shaunna summarizing it, because as a former attorney, I feel like she just really just pulls everything the points. As you know, novelists sometimes, we go off in all these different tangents. So I have to learn from Shaunna about how to do those bullet points and make it a super efficient elevator pitch.
I love that. Yeah, it's like the courtroom summation, right? As opposed to somebody asking me what it's about. I'm like, and then back in April, in my life, I did X and Y, right? Hi, MJ. We see you. Thank you, everybody, for showing up to this party. So, thread collectors, tell me how. I have so many questions, like my brain just sort of shorted out. But the first thing that I want to know is about process, actually. Who came up with the idea? Did you both come up with the idea? And how did your collaboration come about? It's 3 questions in one, which an interviewer should never do, but I'm just so curious.
Well, I think, if I jump in on this one, the Thread Collectors basically is a complete collaboration between the two of us. There were, back in 2017, I had a very rough idea for a Civil War book. It was like the roughest diamond possible. Being a novelist, that something might strike you or you find it interesting and you start building it in your head. I was definitely in the basement of the foundation. Like, there wasn't what became the Thread Collectors. But Shaunna and I have known each other for over 13 years. We actually met at Stephen, my husband, he's an attorney. So we met actually at an attorney conference in Las Vegas. And you'll also appreciate this because you know me, I'm not a big drinker. I was standing at line at the bar and letting every single man cut in front of me. And I was just daydreaming. And Shaunna came, charging over and said, "Why are you letting every man cut in front of you?" She doesn't like any sort of social injustice at all. And then she said, "And by the way, I love your dress." And so we started talking, and right away she suspected I was an attorney. And she said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a writer." And her eyes sort of popped out, and she said, "I, love to read. I've always wanted to be a writer. I'm dreaming of writing a book someday." And so from that moment on, every time I saw Shaunna, we always were discussing books. I visited her book club. She wanted to know what I was reading. I want to know what she was reading. And if I was thinking of a book, she was always one of the people that I sort of had like a litmus test, and said, like, "I'm thinking about maybe something along this. What do you think?" So in 2017, we met for drinks, and I had just seen Rick Burns's documentary, Burying the Civil War Dead. And I was really struck by this documentary that highlighted that 180,000 Black men had enlisted to fight on the Union side for freedom during the Civil War. And also that instead of being given muskets to fight, they were also given they were not given muskets to fight. They were given pickaxes and hoes and forced to dig ditches, do manual labor. And most heartbreaking, they were the ones responsible for burying their fallen white comrades. And in this documentary, Rick Burns highlighted how sometimes maps would be created because the dead had to be buried so quickly. And friends would often want to document where they had left their friends' bodies behind in the hope that after the war, the bodies could be reclaimed and buried properly by the family. So I said to Shaunna, I had this flash of an idea. Wouldn't it be interesting if there was an unexpected friendship between a Black soldier and a white soldier, and the Black soldier is forced to bury his friend? I'm not giving any spoilers because the novel ended up being very different, but he creates a map on a scrap of paper in the hope that one day his friend's body can be reclaimed. So I said that to Shaunna just to see what her reaction would be. And then I'll pass it on to Shaunna so she can describe how she reacted to that.
So as a Southern woman, actually the Civil War always feels very close when you're living in the South. And I don't think Alyson knew it at the time, but I've always been fascinated by Civil War history. So immediately I was like, yes, definitely Civil War novel. But I also wanted to know about the Black soldier's motivations and what was his backstory. So I said to Alyson, well, what if we took the map? Because it's probably going to be rudimentary. If he's, running from enslavement, he's not going to be able to read or write, What if he took the map and he gave it to his beloved and she sewed something that was more permanent? Because there's a rich tradition of repurposing cloth and thread in the African-American tradition. I'm privileged to come from a family where my parents didn't grow up with much, but I have these beautiful handed down quilts that have like my great grandmother's like field dresses in them. And they're just these tiny little strips. And you can tell that the it's worn material, but someone has made something new out of it. And so that was what flashed in my head. And so Alyson and I started thinking about that. And of course, love, who doesn't love? But we didn't do anything with it, Jenna. She finished her one glass of wine. I had like my third glass of wine. We hugged very tightly and said, okay, see each other soon. And we just left. So that was in 2017. And it wasn't until 2020, when we were going through so much, right? The world is suffering through the pandemic. And after the murder of George Floyd here, when everyone is thinking about racial justice and kind of re-examining and reawakening to what, as individuals, we owe to society and how we should be thinking about our place in it, I had a lot of white girlfriends, allies calling me, asking me how I was doing, asking how they could be helpful, how they could learn, how they could grow. And Alyson called me, but she called me with a much different proposition, one that at first I actually couldn't say yes to. She said, do you remember that Civil War novel we were talking about? And I was like, uh-huh. And she said, I think now is the right time for us to write that. Well, for me to write that book. And I was like, okay, read the room, but maybe, I don't know, maybe not. But then she said, I want you to write it with me, which was such an incredible offer of herself and her time and partnership. And I didn't even know then what it would ultimately turn out to be. But I didn't say yes right away because I know her work ethic. I know how deeply she researches her novels. And I was in such pain at the time. I didn't know if I could devote the level of emotional energy that it would take to dive back into the most racially divisive time in our country while we're living through the most racially divisive time in my life. So I had to think about it. And then ultimately, because I trust her and because I value her friendship, I said, let's try it. But with the condition that, like, if it doesn't feel right for me, I need to be able to, like, pull the plug, and of course, Alyson is wonderful. And she said, let's try it. So that is how we came together.
Exactly. So from that moment on, Jenna, just to go back to the specificity of your question, we met in the spring of 2020 in person. It was the first time either of us had met, like, during the pandemic, another person outside our immediate circle. And we just started dreaming and discussing what this novel would be. We also discussed how we were going to write it. And what we decided is that we didn't want to have chapters where I wrote the Jewish, people sometimes think like, oh, did you write the Jewish characters and Shaunna wrote the Black characters? That wasn't going to be our way of writing this book from the very beginning. It wasn't like we tried and it failed. We wanted to create one narrative seamless voice that would pull you into the story and hit all the notes that we wanted to hit with this novel. So we wrote the book with a Google Doc. So both of us having access to it, which was a completely new process for me. I've never worked in that way, never worked on a Google Doc actually before that, but we were all learning all different types of new technology during the pandemic. And what we would do is every Sunday night, we would brainstorm what was going to happen, like, in the next chapter. So we started with the prologue and how we were going to draw the story in. And then every Sunday we would discuss that, and I would take a first pass in very broad strokes to sort of create almost like a gesture drawing of what we had discussed. Or I also like the artistic metaphor of a wire armature. And then I would tell Shaunna, and she would start putting a layer of clay, and then I would put a layer of clay. And we never moved on to the next chapter until we felt we had achieved that perfection with that. I never have written sort of a first messy draft like some I think authors like to do just to get to the end. I move very slowly and just building one block next to the next until you have that structure. Shaunna was very comfortable, and we both sort of seamlessly work the same way. So sometimes we would work on the first 3 chapters. It would take us a month to even move on past that, but there was a sense of let's get it right and then just keep moving, and that's what we did.
It's a very Hemingway kind of story. I always think about Hemingway saying all you have to do is write one true thing, but never moving on until the next sentence, until he felt that the original sentence was as true and as good as he could make it. So you guys are both sort of like using the Hemingway model, which I find so impressive, because I am a messy first drafter. And I agree with Tori that like this conversation is giving me goosebumps, like the spirit of collaboration in it, and the genesis, the social genesis for writing the book, as well as the creative genesis, is really inspiring to all of us. The research, because it's such a research heavy book, as any historical fiction is, it's a heavy lift. And yet I personally love doing the research for historical fiction, and also sometimes find it a bit of a rabbit hole. Did you both do the research? How did you divide up that task?
So we did both do the research, and this is where I think being a former practicing attorney comes in handy. I read pretty quickly. I'm not daunted by a whole pile of research. It's something that I happen to enjoy as much as I know Alyson enjoys as well. And we were, blessed with professors and other sources that were giving us reading lists. And I have to say, Alyson read many more books on the reading list than I did, because I actually have a day job. But we would come across these facts, and we had another Google Doc. We have a lot of Google Docs. So we had a Google Doc with like research facts in there. And whenever we would come across something that was important or we really wanted to highlight, we would put it in the document. And if we both agreed that there was something that both of us felt we should have known and we didn't know, or it was really truly poignant, that is where we're like, okay, so let's dig into that more. And there were a couple of things, either based on proximity, because I was able to go down to Louisiana, most of my family's still down there, so I could do field research, right? Like I did a lot of the research around Port Hudson, or when Alyson it was coming across things that she thought might be good for like a viewpoint of what's happening in the Northeast, for instance, like the burning of the Colored Children's Asylum. We might say, okay, well, Alyson, you look into that more, Shaunna, since you can use a Southern, twang with the people down in New Orleans, call them and see what you can get. So it really just happened quite naturally that we together found things we were fascinated by.
And so you did field research during, it sounds like 2020. How long did this book take you to co-write?
So I'm almost embarrassed to say, because normally my books take almost 3 years to write, but I've never had a partner who's as efficient as Shaunna, who cut the research in half. And, we sold the book on 40 pages. So we had a deadline. So we wrote this book in a year.
Oh my God. Okay. So I'm going to return to my question, but I have to say, historical novelists out there, you should all work with lawyers. Like, I need a lawyer to work with now, because I, like Alyson, take like 3 to 5 years to write a book.
Right. And Shaunna, Jenna, like there are many times when you're writing a novel and you think, well, there are 2 ways I can go there, or maybe there's 4, and you kind of ponder them and you start writing them in your head, the different paths you could take. I would say to Shaunna, well, she could do this or this. What do you think? And she would be like, she has to go here. And I'd be like, oh, okay. And then so.
I am incredibly decisive, but I want to put an asterisk on the year, because we know that time lost all meaning during the pandemic. We had nowhere to go, right? So like, other than my job and like logging on, you weren't going to parties, you weren't going, like everything got delivered if you were fortunate enough to be in that situation. So it was a year, but it was a year when we know that life in many ways stopped.
That's true. Like we worked on the weekend, like 7 days a week on the book.
I always felt during the pandemic that the rest of the world got kind of welcomed into my writer life. Like, first of all, everybody dressed for shit, basically. And I actually had to get dressed up from the waist up. Everybody's like, wow, I'm dressing so badly. I'm like, welcome to writer life. But I have always worked weekends and always worked holidays when I was inspired by a project, and then like not at all when I wasn't inspired by a project. So again, I need to find a partner to work with to like keep me on the track. And it sounds like you made a lot of executive decisions, Shaunna and Alyson. I imagine in some ways it was kind of nice to just relax back.
It was really nice because it did eliminate the constant not wondering, that's not the right word, but the hesitation to commit to a direction that I wasn't necessarily, I would ponder that a lot more if I was working by myself. And with Shaunna, it was like, we had built-in sounding boards with each other, and that really enabled us to feel, again, creating this united voice to move forward and do that with a definiteness that I don't think when I'm writing by myself that I have that until I've gone through the different scenarios. Like I have to, you know what I mean.
Well, I think one of the most difficult things about being a novelist, if you're not working with somebody else, is that you are an autocrat. It's one of the joys because you get to make all the executive decisions about your own mental kingdom. But writer doubt, I feel, is the most endemic part of being a writer, except maybe for Shaunna. Like, hopefully you never discover this.
I will say
True. And there was never any doubt. Like if I asked, if I said, well, this or this, there was no doubt. There was, this is the way.
Well, that's only because I've been cast as a decision maker. There were many times when I called you and I said, well, what about X, Y, and Z? And you're like, I don't know. So I'm sure that writer doubt at some point will strike me, but it didn't really strike me often in the Thread Collectors. That's all I'll say.
Well, I certainly hope it does not, because I think every novel represents 100,000 decisions, from character to plot to punctuation to word choice to whatever. And it never occurred to me that maybe working with another person would shortcut that and also feel as though you were holding somebody's hand when you were making these decisions, like these sort of endless tributaries that you can otherwise wander down. So I have to ask this because I always am fascinated by collaborations. Was there a time when you disagreed, and how did you handle it?
So I don't think disagreement is the right word for the times when we had what I'll call really intense discussions. One of the things that we agreed upon from the very beginning was that we were going to have to be maybe more brave and authentic and honest about aspects of our cultural heritage that we wanted to bring in that then maybe we otherwise would in a friendship. You can love a friend, but that doesn't mean that you rip off your skin, bare your soul, and tell them how you feel about moving through the world as a Jewish woman or as a Black woman. But we knew we needed to bring that level of authenticity to our novel together. So there were times when we would have conversations because we were viewing the world differently, just as you do. And so that was showing up in our characters and the choices. But it was just another opportunity for a conversation. There is not a single word, sentence, etc. in this book that I'm like, I wish Alyson didn't exist because I would have done it totally different. Because we just didn't gloss over those kind of things, right? We just like hashed it out to the bottom.
Yeah.
Hopefully you agree with that, Alyson.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like I almost wish there was some story I could tell, like one time we got
it up.
together, and it could be like Dynasty where like I threw a drink over the screen or something, but it was never like that at all. I think another wonderful thing about technology is when we were each reading the manuscript at different hours, if there was something that didn't strike us as right or that we wanted to change, we didn't just go over the person's sentence and change it. We would put like a comment, like, I don't feel really like she would do this. Can we discuss? Or this word is striking me wrong, but let's discuss. I mean, obviously there were times where you would enrich the sentence and embroider it and not put a comment there. But if there was something that, like the pee underneath the mattress where it was rubbing you the wrong way, you just kind of flagged it, and then as friends do, you just discussed it, and then we found a way to make it so that it was smoothed over and it felt comfortable to both of us.
You guys gave me a sort of a door to walk through here to one of my questions that I had when I was reading this with such great admiration, that I've always wanted to write a Civil War novel because it's a time that is so fraught. It seems foundational to American culture because obviously we're seeing reverberations of it in our political situation today. And I've never been quite brave enough. And I was wondering, like, what that felt like. Were there moments as a Black author and a Jewish author and both women, like, what can you each describe for me maybe like one of the difficult conversations, not difficult, that's not the right word, but like one of the intense conversations where you said like, hey, like I see this way and you see it that way. Let's share these perspectives. Like, I would just love to know what that nexus was like for each of you, because I think it's such an amazing, a strengthening thing that you wrote this together about such a fraught time in our history.
Do you want to
do you want me to go? Yeah. Go first. I mean, one of the things that even before we started writing, because we were having these conversations about trying to build our characters and know their souls before we sat down to write them, is that Shaunna, coming from Louisiana, had so much knowledge that I was unfamiliar with. I mean, just her discussions about, the Code Noir, that that there was an entire would you say legal system, Shaunna? I don't even know if it's the right word, but based on what percentage of Black you were and the certain rights you had from that. And so it would, from being biracial to, to even one, you told me like 1/32 Black, right? There were, those were, parts of the code and how you were seen as being Black in Louisiana at this time. Also, this sense of wanting to show in our book that there were free Blacks, Blacks who owned their own businesses and their own homes, how your different shade of color afforded you different opportunities. So we have Stella, who is a light-skinned Black woman whose mother is able to, put her in a situation where she's not in the fields, but she's still in sexual bondage and she's enslaved, to a white man. So these sort of conversations about things that honestly I didn't have any idea about to enrich the novel was really important because I was learning in the process of writing with her. I think another thing that was just really daunting for me when I think back up to 2017 and wanting to write a Civil War book is that there's something about when you are writing historical fiction and someone says, "Oh, I'm writing a World War II novel." At this point, maybe not when we wrote our novel, Shaunna, Jenna, in 2011 or before that there is sort of a romantic quality to that era. I think Civil War people often think it's very old and dusty and, as you said, fought with things that we are so overwhelming, also considering the parallels to our time. And I think it becomes very easy to say, I don't want to go there. But somehow this energy between Shaunna and I, and what she was bringing to the conversation, and hopefully what I was bringing with my family history with the Jewish I have two great uncles who fought on opposite sides during the Civil War. It energized the project.
Thank you. First of all, Jenna, I want to say thank you for acknowledging that our current situation is still very, very, very much based on some of the same issues that 600,000 men died for. Because I do think what Alyson is saying about people feeling that it's ancient history, that resonates with me. So there are two things that jump to mind when you ask that question. The first is about how people feel about the Civil War and whether it feels relevant or not to them, and slavery in particular. So on the list of books that we were recommended to read, one of them is Tia Miles' nonfiction book, All That She Carried, which attempts to recreate the history of a sack that an enslaved mother gives to her daughter right when they're being separated by a forcible sale. And a few generations later, the granddaughter attempts to kind of recreate the story of the separation, of the brutal separation, in colored thread on the sack. And there was a scene in our novel where Amine, the older sister, is teaching Stella about colors and threads and how you could think of color. And it was inspired by that nonfiction book, that excerpt of it. But when Alyson was reading the book, she called me and she said to me, she was very moved, obviously, reading this nonfiction book about this mother being separated from daughter. And she said, this reads like a Holocaust book to me. And I said, well, of course it does. And in spite of her education and her empathy, that hadn't occurred to her. And I guess just being a Black woman in the world, it's so painful sometimes. Everyone's focused on the trauma of their own people. So I don't mean to suggest they shouldn't, but it's so painful to live in a country where we can be highly, highly focused on certain aspects of our history, but almost running away from and not seeing the parallels to other parts of our history. So that was one thing that, like, I remember that being a real moment for me to say, like, okay, we're going to have to go like super, super deep in this process for us to have those conversations. And then the other thing is there's all the Black women in the novel are named after women in my family and loosely inspired. And the matriarch of the Black family. Janie is inspired by a great aunt of mine who managed to become like financially independent and be a landowner and even a lender to her family. But there is a scene in there where she gives some maternal advice to Stella that is, and I don't want to give away any spoilers, that is a little bit jarring to our modern sensibilities. And Alice and I really had to talk about, and I don't, to Allison's credit, she wanted to have the conversation, but I really gave my perspective that being a Black mother, I'm not fortunate enough to have children, I have stepchildren, but being a Black mother, being a Black woman comes with different limitations, which limits your choices and maybe makes them seem cold or harsh. But if you are protecting your children and you're ensuring survival, it takes away a layer of what we might think of it as like the optimal demonstration of maternal love. And I remember that being a super hard thing for me to think about. It made me think about my relationship with my mother's relationship with her mother, and all of the times when it's been undoubtedly impacted by the fact that their choices were limited as Black women. So I don't know. That's a lot. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get so heavy.
Oh my gosh, no, I think you have to get heavy with this book. And I was wondering when I was coming up with my questions, I have like some softball questions, the questions that I ask, like I just sort of keep in my back pocket to ask any author. And they're things I'm genuinely interested in, but this book is so important. And I feel as though what you're saying demonstrates not only the necessity for writers to work together, like to keep on track, but also maybe for authors of different cultural backgrounds to work together, because it sounds like it was such a learning experience, like an emotional learning curve for both of you. And I'm incredibly inspired. So I thank you for sharing honest answers about a very difficult topic. I mean, one of the questions that I'm like, I don't know if I can ask these particular questions, but one of them was about, you're writing a Civil War book. This is such a fraught time to be writing a Civil War book. And what was each of your perspectives on how you felt the thread collectors echoes our current situation? Like, and how do you feel more or less hopeful about the future of our country from having written a collaborative novel about the past? So I will throw that question to you, and then I'm going to turn it over to some audience questions after this. So enjoy another light.
Well, I know you have a good answer for this, Shaunna, because I know that we talked about this. So
it's interesting. So I was at an event last night at the New York Historical Society, which is a great place, and actually some of their archives inspired Alyson and I. And the keynote speaker, John Meacham, brilliant historian, shared a Winston Churchill quote. And I might have heard it before, but it really resonated with me last night. It said, "The future is unknowable, but the past should give us hope." And if you think about the cataclysmic, war that was the Civil War, where neighbors are fighting against each other, the Alyson's, ancestors fighting brother against brother, battlefields like outside of people's kitchen windows. We got past that. Now, we didn't get past that perfectly. We are still living with the imperfect resolution of the Civil War, and we might, one day want to explore Reconstruction, but we got past it. So I have to feel like we can get past this moment that we are in if we listen a little bit more, lean in a little bit more, examine what we can do to build bridges. I don't want to be a pessimist, right? Like, if I'm a pessimist, I may as well curl up with a bottle of bourbon and draw the covers over my head. I want to feel like we can do better, and that we will.
Yes, and I think there were many times when we were writing the book that there would be scenes that seemed familiar. Like, there's a scene that takes place during Passover, right before the war breaks out. And we have, two brothers and their wives basically talking about Lincoln and the politics and the division within this family that's apparent at, a traditional meal, which we've all had during Thanksgivings and, Christmases and other meals since the 2016 election. And that seemed eerily familiar, as did many other aspects about, are you going to side with one side because of political, economics, taxation, all sorts of things? It's not always just, one overarching, you don't always agree with the enemy on all the different things. It could be one thing that draws you into the war. So those sort of parallels, obviously, were very much in the forefront when we were writing different scenes. But I think Shaunna and I always came back to the intention of the book, was that we wanted to use two different lenses that hadn't looked at the Civil War in this way before, a Black and a Jewish one, and to find friendship, to find bridges that divide us bridges that connect us rather than divide us. And even music being a theme of another language between two men who have different religions, backgrounds, color of their skin. Again, they find common ground and deep friendship. And so these were things that were reaffirming as we wrote them, and did bring light into the darkness when we were writing this novel.
I'm so glad to hear that. I read Heather Cox Richardson every morning before breakfast. She is actually my breakfast. And she, like Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, whom we had the great good fortune to have on Blaze with our thoughtful bro, Mark Cecil, who's also producing for me today. But both Vindman and Heather Cox Richardson remain optimistic. And it's so nice to know that an expert, like a lifelong politician and an expert historian, are drawing the same conclusions and remaining more optimistic than pessimistic about the state of our union. So two more great voices reaffirming that. Thank you so much for that. And I have questions about music. I have questions about sewing. I have questions about the couples in the book, but we also have questions from our audience. And so I will step aside for a moment and take the first audience questions, which I'll read for you guys, okay? Because we're also repurposing this for our Mighty Blaze podcast. Vivian wants to know, will there be further collaboration on another book, perhaps continuing the story? Thank you, Vivian, for attending and for the great question.
Okay, so we are we are all fired up to do another book together. We would love to bring our characters into Reconstruction. The novel, without giving any spoilers, doesn't wrap everything up in a neat bow. We sort of bring our characters to a point of they're about to enter a new journey, and so what's going to happen, when they start that. So I think one of the things that we would love to do is also show how the progeny of our characters, that a musical talent emerges every time with their children or their grandchildren, and see how, against the backdrop of whether it's Reconstruction, the Harlem Renaissance, even the civil rights, how we see these two men and their families be united throughout history, and how also artistic talent emerges against very challenging times.
Super love. Shaunna, do you have anything that you want to add about your future collaboration?
No, Alyson did that beautifully.
Are you like, this is news to me? I didn't know.
No, it's not news to me because we have another Google Doc.
If you build a Google Doc, it will come. I'm so glad. I also think that people think once the war is over, everything is okay. So I'm really glad that you will explore through subsequent generations of characters, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act, not everything is okay, you guys. I hate to tell you this right now. So thank you for continuing to hold up the artistic torch. Question for Shaunna, would you say that being a good lawyer is also about being a good storyteller? Okay, what a great question. Do you think a lawyer has a particular kind of insight into storytelling that others might not?
That is a fascinating question. So there are different types of lawyers. I happen to be a lawyer that would go to the courtroom. I will say, you guys have heard the adage, you're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own set of facts. But what that means is you have to draw out the ones that might resonate with the person that you're speaking to. If it's a judge, if it's a client, if it's an adversary. So I do think that I'm pretty good at looking at something and saying, I think this will land. And so, yeah, I don't know if it's necessary to be a good storyteller. In fact, it's clearly not, but probably doesn't hurt,
You have to
and I will say I'm a really good editor because I've been a lawyer. I can catch double spaces and typos like nobody's business because I've had to work on big briefs. So that's pretty good.
That is a very cool thing. My mom went to law school and she was a classically trained pianist. And in law school, she was highly affronted to find out that she had to tell stories in a concise way and kind of spiraling off in all different directions. And Allie, I will sort of repurpose the question and ask you, what do you think is your secret sauce as a storyteller? What is your superpower? And then did you learn anything different from this process, in addition to knowing that Shaunna was going to say we should go this way?
So So I'm a self-trained novelist. I didn't get an MFA. I was an art history major at college. Before I was an art history major, I wanted to be a painter like my mother. My mother was an abstract artist. So I feel like my talent is creating a scene in which you can see the color, feel the texture, that world is very sensory rich for you. And I also feel that artistic background of having respect for negative and positive space, in the sense that there's sometimes where you have a lot of description, and there's a lot sometimes when you need to pull away when you want certain either poetic sentences or the emotion to emerge in high relief. And so that's very intuitive for me when I'm writing. I think one of the things that I've never loved doing is dialogue. And Shaunna is amazing at dialogue. I mean, she's also amazing when she's telling a story in person, and she does voices and all sorts of, she makes all of her characters come alive when she's just telling you about who she met at the grocery store. But I loved when we would sometimes be on the document together, and it would be like the last pass of that chapter before we moved on. And she would actually read the dialogue aloud, and she would say, that doesn't sound right, or I think it should be phonetic like that. And I could see her like masterfully tweak that in a way that I probably have never put that concentration level on. And I really learned a lot from that, by just to speak aloud your dialogue, to hear how it sounds, the cadence, and refining it after you've done that. So she was a natural with that, and I definitely learned from that.
Now I want to hear some voices, Shaunna. I would like you to answer every question from now on in a different voice.
I mean, there's a scene in the book where the musicians are talking, like William the flutist he's come to a ball, and he's meeting other men black men who've been loaned out for the evening who have musical talent, and they all come from different places. And the way she did that scene where she was talking, I was like, wow, I feel like I'm watching a movie. Like, it was just so great.
That's an amazing, that also is like a secret superpower. Okay, so I think we have 3 more audience burning questions. This is a question from my friend Michelle Marie Martin, who is a historical reenactor as well as a PhD historian. And she and I met at the Little House on the Prairie Museum out in Kansas, and she was in a hoop skirt. So she knows wherever she speaks in terms of historical reenactment. What aspect of the historical research you conducted for this both surprised, shocked, or moved you the most? This is one of my favorite questions of all time to ask any historical novelist. So thank you, Doc Martin.
Shaunna, you should tell about the Port Hudson trip that you did.
So as I mentioned, Port Hudson, it plays a pivotal role in the book. It is a battle where William and Jacob are both involved, and what happens at Port Hudson really, deepens the friendship and opens the novel up even more. Port Hudson is about an hour and a half from where I grew up. And I prided myself on the fact that I had a good education. My parents both love history, but I had never heard of the Battle of Port Hudson. We've all seen that fabulous movie, Glory, and we get it into our heads that maybe the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the all-Black regiment that was basically used as cannon fodder, that was an isolated incident. But the Battle of Port Hudson happened weeks beforehand, and in some ways was even more tragic because the Union officers didn't do appropriate level of reconnaissance. And so hundreds of Black men were led basically into a shooting alley. And the Confederates they just held the higher ground, even though they didn't have the numbers, and they shot down, and hundreds of Black men died, but their bodies lay there for weeks in the sun because the Union officers didn't want to sacrifice good men to go after the bodies. And when they were finally allowed to go and retrieve their fallen comrades, the Black soldiers that remained were the ones responsible for burying them. So you just think about like trauma upon trauma upon trauma. And if you needed any further evidence to know that you were not considered a person, being at the Battle of Port Hudson would have been that. There was a free Black soldier named Lieutenant Andre Kalu, who was responsible for leading the charge. And his body was so decomposed by the time they found it that they had to identify him from his signet ring. The good thing is that when they brought the body back to New Orleans, there was a parade, and Black people really they showed his appreciation. But no matter what faith you are, even if you're not of faith, I mean, you think about what it means to have a good death and to be honored in death. And then you think about the juxtaposition of what happened to the Black soldiers at Port Hudson. And for me, it really moved me. So I went to Port Hudson. I spent a day there with the park ranger. I dragged my then fiance, now husband, and we stood there and I felt it, right? Like I felt the sacrifice. I am a Black Louisianian. These were Black Louisianians that died. And so we knew we had to have it play a pivotal role. I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional. We knew we had to have it play a pivotal role in the book. And I'm so glad that Alyson agreed to that.
And I think, for me, the thing with my research that I was doing up on the Northeast, I had read about the New York Historical Society had a book of 50 artifacts where there were essays connected to those artifacts in their collection. And one of the essays was centered around a charred Bible that had once been in possession of the children's orphanage, the Black Children's Asylum on 42nd and 5th Avenue in New York, which was this beautiful structure that had been created with philanthropic funds. And there was a nursery and there was a school and a beautiful, garden back in the backyard. And many of the Black children who were there, who were orphans there, their fathers had died fighting for freedom, down south during the Civil War. And during the draft riots of 1863, a mob of angry white men tried to burn the orphanage with all 233 Black children to the ground. And if it wasn't for one of the teachers shepherding them out to safety, they would have all perished. The actual structure was basically charred to ruins. But because one wonderful child had the foresight to know that this Bible was important, she took it with her as she was being evacuated, and now it's the only artifact that exists from that particular orphanage. So I remember calling Shaunna up and saying, did you ever hear of this? This is terrible. This actually happened in New York, like steps away from the New York Public Library. And she said, no, I'm completely aware of the terrible things that were happening during the draft riots, the lynchings, all the chaos and the terrible mobs, the violence that they were doing, but she also had never heard of the burning of this orphanage. And so we made this pact, right? Like then, like anything that we both read or, experienced with research like Port Hudson, we knew it had to go in the book, because if we hadn't heard about it, we were pretty certain our readers hadn't, and we felt that it was really important to highlight. That said, we didn't want to have everything be so super saturated and didactic that it happened in these heavy scenes necessarily. And so Lily's voice through her letters, she's able to write to Jacob down south and say what she's experienced in New York, but it's filtered through her own personal her voice. And so that was just something that I think really worked well for us writing the book, is how were we going to incorporate everything we were learning and make sure our readers came away with feeling that they too learned about parts of history that they weren't aware of before they started reading it.
It's a great privilege of the historical novelist to be able to shine the spotlight on forgotten corners of history, but I'm really glad that you both chose to do this about some really difficult situations, so thank you. I obviously made a mistake scheduling this interview because I should have scheduled it for 6 hours because I have so many questions. And I think we have time for this one more, which my producers put up on screen. And guys, if you have asked questions that we weren't able to get to today, follow both of these authors, go to their websites, follow them on social media. Our producer will put the link in the chat. Meanwhile, question for both of you: what skill of your writing partner were you most impressed with and grateful for during this process? What a great landing question.
So I will say, and Alyson has alluded to it, she writes the way pictures unfold in your mind. And I think it is because she is such an accomplished art historian and she's an accomplished painter herself. But when she writes, you see it. And I think that that is an incredible skill, particularly for someone like me. I watch a lot of the telly and things like that. But when I pick up a book, I want to just be fully immersed. And I think Alyson is very good at creating worlds.
And I think for me, again, it's, Shaunna has such a natural way with dialogue. I definitely learned so much, as I said before, about that. but I also think she has a very penetrative way to understand the essence of a character, to know their soul in a way that makes her decision making always on point. You know, for example, what she had cited before about our mother Janie of Stella and Amine, there are certain times where she has to act and make sometimes really hard decisions. But Shaunna always was able to succinctly say why she felt that she should make this decision, because she understood her soul from, you know, her skin down to her bones, you know. So for me, it was a wonderful co-partnering experience, because again, it eliminated any sort of hesitation. It was the sense like, we know these people we're creating, and we're, you know, part of them are leading us on this journey of where we have to go.
I love that. It's almost like being a medium.
Yes, yeah, 100%.
Which I often think being a writer is a little bit like when you're channeling your imaginary people who then become so real. That it has been such a joy to listen to both of you talk about your collaboration, about what you learned, about how you work together. Also so inspiring for all of us, like politically and literarily, just made up that word. And I urge you all to go and buy the Thread Collectors, at least 50 or 60 copies of the Thread Collectors, to give to everybody you know who might want word pictures, who might want to discover forgotten history, and who might want to feel that our own history reflects a little bit of optimism for the future. So please, guys, it's a beautiful book. Our producer is going to put the link in the chat. You can click on it and buy your 50 or 60 copies. Right?
And thank you so much, Jenna, for having us. It was a wonderful interview. We so appreciate you reading so deeply the book.
Yes, this conversation has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. The pleasure is all ours. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning into The Blaze today. Alyson, Shaunna, Alyson, we cannot wait to see where your collaboration takes you next. We will all be watching avidly. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Happy